Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. It's this afternoon in the UK. I suppose it's either the evening or uh, could be early in the morning if you're in North America. I want to talk to you a little bit today about data and AI at Cyclum. Just a quick intro to myself, aside from what Serena's already discussed. I got into this field so it's close to 20 odd years ago when I was doing my university degree. I did a module on AI and ML at the time, and I was completely hooked. I was working as a software engineer at the time, and I did my degree part time. And at that point, I moved into working in business intelligence and analytics because it was the closest thing you could do to working in AI where I lived at the time. But I could immediately recognize the potential of that technology, right? And I think finally, it seems like in 2023 and 2024, the rest of the world has really caught up, and we've really started to see a lot of hype around AI and the role of AI and in our daily lives. And that's something that at Cyclum we're able to help our clients to build and to develop, which is um, for me, it's a lot of fun, and it's actually, I think, quite an important role in society. So let's get into what we want to talk about. Just to give you a bit of an overview, we're going to talk a little bit about the industry in 2024 and some of the things that we've seen over the last year. I want to run you through an example of the type of project that we do at Cyclum. So we're going to run you through one of our client case studies and how that project evolved and what we were able to do to help with our clients' customers' experience and how we used AI in that. We'll start to look into 2025. So look at some of the things that we're doing with clients, some of the offering or some of the directions that we're going to be going in from a technology perspective, including things like governance and ethics, the role of the developer, advances in technology. And then once we get through that stuff, we'll talk a little bit about personal development, right? So what's the industry view on the skills that are required? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we help our people do to keep up to date, and then how do I stay current and pay attention to what's going on in the industry and the sort of things that are happening. So we'll jump right in and we'll start to talk about AI in 2024. So the wider industry in 2024. What were some of the things that we saw? Some of the trends that really landed in 2024. So probably not a big surprise to most people that we saw a massive proliferation of Gen AI in the market. So we saw huge amounts of enterprise adoption. You can see the stat there with 65% of enterprises reporting some regular use of Gen AI. Most of us experience that when we're talking to chatbots for customer service, etc. And so we're starting to see that proliferation increase massively in 2024. And a lot of this is we're starting to see things like user-friendly development platforms. So we're starting to see where with sort of low-code AI application development, it's not just developers that are able to get in to do this type of work, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have a PhD in data science or computer science to be able to work on these technologies. It's starting to get a lot more accessible by the wider kind of development community, if that makes sense. So 2024, massive, huge jumps forward in the proliferation of Gen AI. Not surprisingly, the people that provide the hardware for that technology have seen a massive increase in their value and in their revenue. So if we look at NVIDIA as an example of that, where we saw, there's some stats you can see there, around 217% increase in their revenue over 2023, which is a massive, considering that most organizations would consider 10% or 15%, depending on the industry, as quite a good year. 217 is pretty eye-watering. And again, you see things like AWS released Trainium 2 this year. They're expecting to release Trainium 3 in 2025. So again, AWS keeping up pace with massive increases in the capability of the hardware. And again, not surprising that we see these sorts of things happening as enterprises are starting to invest in Gen AI. So the tech industry is starting to respond to that. And certainly in the last year, they have. Expect more of that in 2025. So multimodal, this is something that we've seen at Cyclum, some where we worked on some projects where we've started to leverage multimodal capabilities of some of the large language models that we work with. The ability to not only integrate or to ingest data from multiple different formats, but to generate data in multiple different formats. So where we had Gen AI that was largely text-based, in early 2024 and coming into 2024 from 2023. In 2024, we start to see lots more involvement of other formats like images, videos, audio, that sort of thing. So the kind of the multimodal nature of AI is increased, and that's been pretty staggering. The pace and the level of advancement that we've seen across those technologies. Open source. This is something that we actually have a lot of experience with at Cyclum. So we started to see a lot more smaller and efficient models, and quite often we use these for very specific use cases or very specific. If we have an architecture that has a specific task, and we don't need the kind of the massive capability that a large language model like your Anthropics or your OpenAIs, we don't need that level of power. We have a very narrow set of tasks that we need the model to take on, and you don't need, so you can build cheaper, more efficient, more customizable open source models that you're able to deal with a lot more easily, or like have a lot more control over what they're doing. And again, there's a cost factor of how much it costs to implement and deploy these technologies. So again, we start to see developers working on these things, and this is something that our developers are getting involved in and helping to develop some of these open source models and then publish that code um, into the public domain, if that makes sense. So again, open source, keeping track with proprietary and private models that are being developed at pace in the background. And then finally, ethics and regulation. And this is something that we're starting to see a lot more of. Is something we'll talk about as we go through. But for those of us that were paying attention, the EU published the AI Act into law in 2024. We start to see that come into effect as early as February in 2025 for some of the more restrictive components around prohibited uses of AI. So that starts to impact in 2024. We'll talk a lot more about that in a few minutes, especially around kind of the responsible AI and how organizations are starting to look at the ethics of how they use this technology. And this is something that we work very closely with our clients with, as you can imagine, as they start their journey into or start or continue their journey into using this type of technology. So I won't belabor this slide too much, but I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a view of some of the stuff that we've done in 2024. So if you look at some of the clients we work with, there's some pretty big names on there. We've got Deloitte, AstraZeneca, Insight Partners, which is a massive investment firm that we do a lot of work with. Jaguar Land Rover, which you can see in the middle there. We've done a really big and impressive and actually really cool project with them. A couple of projects actually, so that we're working very closely with JLR on how we develop their AI capability. Some of the practices, some of the numbers that we have in our practice. So we have, I think at the moment, over the course of 2024, we had over 19 Gen AI projects that we were all working on. 10 of those going into production. I think that number is actually slightly out of date. I think we've got more that have gone in the last month or so, but 10 that I know that are definitely in production. And there's a few other things that are pretty cool in there. We were the first NVIDIA partner in Europe. That's a very old stat because we partnered with them a few years ago. But again, you can see we invested very early on in developing these types of technologies and building these skills and capabilities within the organization. So, and again, the last thing is you can see some of the partnerships we have with tech vendors along the bottom line there, where we do work with NVIDIA. We do a lot of work with Anthropic. OpenAI is a technology that we use with clients quite often. Databricks, Snowflake. These are all sort of industry leaders that we see, and we work very closely with their technology. These are all technologies that we will embed in our solutions and that we work with our clients. So I want to try and give you a sense of what a project looks like and how that impacts on one of our clients. So we'll go through this relatively quickly. But Inspired AI it's actually an education company, or it started out as an education company. They run a network of private schools. Is what they do. You can see this is an example of one of their schools. I believe this is their school in Geneva. So it looks very nice, I have to say. My school certainly didn't look like that, right? Where I went to school. But they have a massive network of schools. They have thousands of students that they manage globally. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at how when we went to talk to them, we initially talked to them about how we could improve the experience of the people that are involved. And we did a product discovery piece with them. We looked at what are the personas in their business that we could have an impact on. And that included teachers, students, administrators, faculty or facilities workers. But we eventually settled on the parents, right? We thought we'd see the parents seem like the ones that we could have the biggest impact on in terms of the level of their experience. And as a parent myself, I'm very close to this, right? Because this is the story of my life, right? I have a 14-year-old son, right? And when he comes home from school, effectively, I'll ask him how his day was, and his response will be probably about thereabouts. That's about as much information as I can get out of him on a daily basis. He'll say, "Fine, it was good," or "It was okay," or "bad." That's about all you get. You don't get much about what he learned, what he was doing, how his classes went, anything more than that. So the parents don't get a lot of information. And if they want to get that information, they have to actively go and find it. So if they want to know what assignments their kids have, if they're not getting it from their kids, they have to go talk to the teachers or the teachers' assistants or other people in the faculty in those schools. So it's not a massively great experience for them. And remember, these are private schools, so these parents are paying quite a lot of money for their kids to go into these schools. So the first thing that we did was we looked at how we can corral all of their data together as much as we can. We started with a small subset of schools. We then pulled that information into a series of dashboards. There was a mobile app, which gave the parents access to a lot of this information. So they got information about their kids' curriculum. They got information about their grades, their attendance, what assignments they had. So it was very, very much the academic sort of view of how their children were doing. And that was sort of the first iteration of what we were able to do with them. And it was very successful. Parents loved it, right? They could go onto their app and they could see, oh, little Jimmy's got a test on Friday, and I can see that he got this score on his test last Friday. Brilliant. He would have never told me that. I would have had to email the teacher to get that information. But when we went out to talk to the parents afterwards and said, "Is it good? Did you like it?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's good, but it's not giving me everything that I need," right? They still had some questions that were left unanswered. So it went from "How was your day at school?" to "Is today a swimming day?" Right? Do I need to send my kid into school with their swimming gear? Right? Do they need their football kit? Is it do they have a match after school, or is it their phys ed class? And when's the school play, right? Because, as a parent, you never want to miss that. That's the sort of thing that your children talk about to their therapists and when they're adults about how their parents messed their lives up. So parents are really interested in these types of questions because basically parents don't want to look stupid, right? And I feel this personally, right? I want to make sure that I'm not that parent that doesn't send their kids to school with the right equipment and everything like that. So we looked at building a little bit more of a sophisticated interface, right? A little bit more. We brought more data in to the brought more data into the solution, but then we were also able to give the parents a better interface so that they could interact with that data more efficiently. And basically, we connected all the data together, pushed it through. This is an early conceptual architecture. I can't show the actual architecture, but this is the sort of thing that we were doing. So we brought in a large language model to use on top of this. We built a vector database around the data that existed in the back end, and then provided a chat interface so that the large language model could interpret the questions, go and find the data that was required to answer those questions, summarize it into a meaningful response, and then pass that back to the parents. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this is the parent helper in action, right? So this is the web version, so they can go in onto the website, they can log in, go to the parent view, they can go to the parent helper chat interface, and they can ask things like, how many times has John been absent? It'll give them the details. They can get all of their grades. Again, remember, this is a private school network, so they can ask, what's our account balance? How much do we owe for the rest of the semester, et cetera, et cetera. And this was where, and this is where the parents could ask things like, when does John have his swim day, right? And it would say swim days are Tuesdays and Fridays, every second Tuesday of the month, whatever. So this is, once we kind of got this up to speed, this is where the parents really started to engage, right? And we saw that we really had a massive impact on the experience of being parent of a student at one of the inspired schools. In this case, Red M School in Berkshire. So that's an example of one of the types of projects that we look at, right? So that's something that that's the kind of stuff that we were building in 2024, right? Up until this point. So what I want to do is start to look a little bit at what things look like going forward at Cyclum in data and AI from 2025. So a few things that we'll look at. We'll look at how we engage with clients. So we'll look at acceleration and innovation. We'll look at responsible AI and how we build offerings around that, how we engage with our clients. And I know that's super exciting for me, but for you guys are probably a lot more interested in the technical side, right? So we'll look at some of the trends that we're seeing and some of the things that we're looking at from an AI-enabled development perspective. We'll look at agentic AI. And we'll look at modern approaches and a couple of examples of some new languages that we're starting to experiment with at Cyclum. So how are we accelerating clients' agenda? I'm not going to go on too much about this, but just to give you a sense of, again, what a project looks like. So if you take the example of inspired AI, this was the type of approach that we took with the client. So we go in and we start to think about what are the concepts of that they have in their business, right? Like conceptually, what are the experiences that their users are having? What are the experiences that their staff are having? What does the workflow look like? Basically, what we're trying to do is identify opportunities where we can bring in some technology and we can have an impact and improve those experiences. We can increase the customer satisfaction, or we can increase the efficiency of their staff, right? So there were lots of opportunities for us to go through. We go through and we discover what conceptually that looks like. We then go into a product discovery phase, and we'll start to throw some ideas out against if these are all the challenges that they're seeing in their business, these are the types of ideas that we have to meet those challenges, right? Now, at this stage, we're not really focusing on AI directly, right? To us, AI is a tool that we can use, right? It's not the goal of what we're doing. We're not going in to use AI. What we're doing is we're going in to improve the experience or to create value for the client. And if AI is a good way of doing that, then that's the tool that we'll use, right? And so we pull all of those ideas together. We put that into a product framework. So we think of these things as products. They have features, and we go through a process of developing that product, and that goes into an MVP launch at some stage, right? As soon as we've gone through an initial development process. And again, just to kind of give you a sense of how that looks over the longer term, when we move from concept to execution, and then we start to really focus in on that user experience. So once we hit the MVP stage, which in this case would be around about this blue line here, we again refine down to, what's the actual core of the experience that we need to get to. If you think about the inspired example, the MVP launch would have been the initial launch of the dashboard and the mobile app, right? We then go through a user experience process and we say, okay, is this answering all your questions? Are you getting the type of experience that you need? They say, well, yes, mostly, but there's some things missing. And then we develop more features that we add into that product, and then those features go into execution. And then we eventually build out the the AI model with the chatbot interface. And then once that's completed, that goes into launch. And we don't stop there. Once we get through launch, we continue on. We continue working with the users. We continue looking at how we can improve the quality of that product. We look at what features we can add, what features can we improve, right? And we move from the initial user experience into performance. So we just make the products better. We make it faster. We increase we increase the scope of the questions that it can ask. So we have this long-term client engagement that we go through over a longer period. So these projects tend to last, from months into the MVP into years going through the experience and performance improvement side of things. So that's how we look to engage with our clients and help them to provide value. So let's talk a little bit about the ethics side of things. All right. So 2024 regulation started to come into place, right? Now, regulation isn't the only thing that we need to worry about from a responsible AI perspective or from an ethics perspective. There's also things like reputational risk. And then there's just other ethical problems about how do you use this technology effectively? Excuse me. How do you use it effectively? How do you get it into businesses where, people are worried about their jobs? This is going to be transformative technology, I think, probably that we haven't seen for generations. And we want to be very careful how we deploy it. And responsible AI is the name of the kind of ethical framework and the responsibility framework that we are going to look to put in place with our clients. So I want to give you a definition of what that means, right? This is a bit of a hybrid definition from a lot of sources that I found online. So if we think about it as a strategic approach to AI governance and best practice, and the stuff that I've emboldened here around things like how do we manage AI applications effectively? How do we mitigate risk? And how do we create a safe environment where we can innovate effectively and develop AI applications successfully? So the main focus for me here with responsible AI isn't about restricting what people can do necessarily. It's about providing a framework that people can operate in so that they can innovate successfully, right? Or so they can innovate safely and successfully. A lot of the conversations that we have with our clients at the moment, especially where we're not building AI for them, is they're worried about this. They see risk. They see potential damage. And with the regulations that have come in, that's kind of emphasized. And what we want to do is allow them to feel safe so that they can innovate and they can get the benefit from this technology and not get left behind by people who are able to do it successfully. So we'll talk a little bit about the regulation. For those of us in Europe, and probably to a lesser degree in North America, and I guess probably in Asia, there's versions of this. We've seen this before, certainly in the EU, right? So GDPR was introduced into law in 2016. And at the time, I can remember thinking these fines are pretty eye-watering, right? Like 2% of global turnover. That could be a very big number for a large enterprise, right? And the EU were good to their word, right? Since 2018, when GDPR really started to take effect, they've levied close to 4.5 billion euros worth of fines, which is a huge amount in terms of fines over that period. And with the AI Act, they're actually going a step further, right? So if the EU is not kidding around when they put these things into law, and what they're saying for the AI Act is if you do something that's prohibited, and these are the prohibited practices that start to take effect from February, you could be looking at 35 million or 7% of annual turnover, depending on whichever number is bigger, right? And now that's for people who do stuff that's prohibited, which is most people aren't going to be doing, right? But for everything else, if you're just in normal breach of the AI Act, you're looking at 15 million at 3%. So it's still higher than what GDPR was when it was introduced into law. So they're taking this very seriously in the EU. But regulation isn't, like I said, it's not the only problem, right? So when you think about, there's a lot of things that if you do AI recklessly and badly can go very wrong, and it can be very costly to your organization in terms of reputation. And we've got some examples on here. There's an example where uh, there was a company that's it's called Chat AI that set up a chatbot that there was a tragic result when somebody with mental illness mistook the chatbot for a human, and it's a very bad situation. And nobody, I mean, as an organization, you certainly don't want that on your you don't want your reputation associated with that type of thing. Never mind your conscience, right? No, none of us as developers want to have that sort of thing happen on on any technology that we're working on. The Air Canada example is a little bit more amusing, certainly. Their chatbot was promising free flights to some customers under certain circumstances, and when the customers tried to get the refunds, the airline said, "Oh no, it's just the chatbot's not working properly." So the passengers took them to court and won. And the airline had to abide by what the chatbot had promised. Final example here, the Samsung example. There was a Samsung employee who loaded a bunch of proprietary code and very sensitive code into ChatGPT and asked it to uh, tell him where the bugs were or how to fix the bugs that were in the code. He actually did it with two applications before people found out what he was doing. And of course, because he was using the free version of ChatGPT, that code is now somewhere in the training data set of ChatGPT. So the other things to remember here with these examples, none of these examples are, I don't know about these because I'm an industry insider, right? They're all being published in mainstream media outlets like Forbes and the BBC and Vice. So any mistake that you make as an enterprise with AI, these people are paying attention, right? And these things become global news, and it's very, very public when you make a mistake or when you do something recklessly. So you cannot underestimate the risk to reputation. So how does responsible AI help us with those things, right? So the way that we approach responsible AI is we have a maturity level. We set up a bunch of maturity levels in terms of how responsible you are. Each of those maturity levels will have a set of different types of um, policies or processes or capabilities associated with it. You can see some examples there where we might introduce in under the first couple of levels things like compliance policy, design standards. So these are processes that business processes and policies that we're putting in place, compliance processes that that line up with what's in the AI Act or any other compliance that we see in North America or anywhere else globally. And then there's some technical capabilities that you want to add, like managing your data more effectively, because obviously there's a lot of data involved in developing AI systems, from training data, testing data, integrating data into these systems for actual analysis. So that's a very important part of what you need to do and how sophisticated your data management is or your operational modernization. So, being able to operationally spot issues and to fix those issues with these technologies as rapidly as possible, all very important things to start to put in place. And as you move from left to right on this view, right, and you increase the levels of maturity, the types of innovation that you can do start to open up. So you can start to look at internal employee bots that you can work with, for example, or you can move on to some light touch customer service stuff. Then you can do more advanced and more risky things as your maturity level around responsibility gets higher and higher. So this is an example of kind of how we help our clients to go on their journey, right? Not only from a technical perspective and helping them to build DIY applications, but to build that foundation of responsibility underneath and governance that they can make sure that what they're doing it safely and successfully. So let's get into the technical stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about development. Right now, this is a little bit generic across all software development, and this is something that we look at because we do a lot of software development, software engineering at Cyclum. But obviously, this has an impact on data and AI because the applications that we build, we use these similar technologies, right? So we write a lot of code when we're building our data engineering processes, when we're integrating some of the AI models that we leverage, even if they're from our partners or if it's more kind of standard AI models that we develop exclusively in code. We do a lot of software development. So getting into data engineering in our and AI engineering in our division is something that uses a lot of the same type of um, techniques and languages and approaches that we see from software engineering more broadly. So a few things. Um, One of the things that comes up a lot when you look into software development in 2025 is um, the use of AI by developers, right? And I found this stat here, and I thought I'd open with this before, just to put everybody's mind at ease, because I'm sure those of us that are close to the industry are starting to wonder um, how long it's going to be before AI starts to take over. Certainly, that's something that we're all that's something that is must be playing on people's minds. Plays on my mind. But if you look at, there's a really good article I was reading in Forrester, and one of the things that they predicted for 2025 was that at least one organization would try to replace a big chunk of its development capability. So basically, replace its developers with AI, and it would fail spectacularly, right? If you look at what developers do, only about 24% of their time is spent coding on average. Most of the rest of that time is spent working on designs, writing tests, doing bug fixing, meeting with stakeholders. So there's a lot of things that developers do. In fact, most of what developers do isn't just code crunching, right? So it's going to be a while yet before we have AI that's capable of doing all of those things successfully, right? So I wouldn't worry too much about the development industry, certainly not for the next few years, as far as AI is concerned. One thing that we do expect to see, though, is the use of coding assistants. Now, in 2023, there's a stats that I picked up from a Gartner article talking about how 10% of developers were using AI code assistants, which is probably that guy from Samsung who was one of them who was using ChatGPT. And then there'll be other people who are using similar type assistants or using some version of coding assistants in 2023 that were AI based, right? Not just going to Stack Overflow and copying and pasting the code that you found in there into your own code. This is actually engaging with AI, right? Now, more recently, I picked up another article that suggested that 50 to 60% of developers currently are working with some form of AI code assistance. And the examples that they were talking about there are things like GitHub Copilot, Amazon Code Whisperer, or Tab9. So already we're starting to see a lot of developers, in fact, half, if not most of developers using these types of tools, right? And you can see from the image on the left, some of the things that the developers are getting from these tools. So they're getting a better experience. They're they're reducing the amount of time it takes to switch from tasks and to maintain flow states, improving customer experience, reducing bugs because their code is more standardized, and they're getting to market faster. So they're getting their code out faster by using these tools. So there's lots of really good value that these tools can add to the development community if they're used effectively. So what does that look like in 2025? So the most recent stat that I can find suggested that currently, or not currently, but by the end of 2025, we'd be looking at 75 to 85%, right? Now, the original article I wrote was something like 75% by the end of 2028. But because of the proliferation of these types of tools and the pace that they're moving at, it's starting to look like that's going to accelerate. So we're going to start to see people to use a lot more of these developers using these types of tools towards the end of 2025. And then by the time we get to 2028, it looks pretty much universal. The stats that I could see suggested the estimates were something like 97% or greater of all developers will be using some form of code assistant as part of their development work. So that's what we think that those types of tools are something that we're expecting to see a lot more of. But what are the types of languages that are coming along that we're starting to experiment with at Cyclum, where we're starting to see um, potential for a lot more advances, not only in performance, but in capabilities, security, et cetera, right? So languages that are coming along that just look very strong. And you can see some examples that we're going to go through here, including Rust, Go, uh, Mojo, or Mojo, depending on whether you're in Spain or in the Spanish speaking world, and Bend is another example. So I want to talk a little bit about Rust. So Rust comes up in Forrester as something that's going to be slotting into the top 10 most used languages in 2025. It's experienced something like 50% increase in usage over the last few years, with something like 3.5 million engineers that have joined the community over the course of that 3 years. Internally, our IoT and embedded teams, they're already working with clients like P&G and using Rust because it's great for device use cases. It's very fast, very efficient, but it's not limited to device use cases. And actually, it's growing in popularity as a general purpose backend language. So, let's look at why this is, right? And let's look at an example. So, CrowdStrike. Most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with CrowdStrike and what happened earlier this year with that company. So obviously, for those of us that don't know, it's a cybersecurity solution. Amongst other things, it's used to prevent your employee laptops from falling victim to cyber attacks. So it's security software, effectively. It's installed in your machine, but instead of being installed on top of Windows like most apps, it's actually installed inside Windows. So it's embedded within your Windows application. And it can better detect cyber threats in that way. And it needs to be as efficient as possible for this type of work, as you can imagine. So it can affect the performance of the laptop. It can actually affect the performance of the laptop when users simply uninstall it, right? So it's very close to your Windows application. So CrowdStrike decided to write their software in a combination of C and C++. Very efficient languages. However, they're notoriously difficult to write in, and they often have issues with memory safety. So what happened with CrowdStrike, they pushed out an update with an error in the code. Now, the error meant that CrowdStrike software thought it had 21 ways of detecting a cyber attack, or 21 sensors that it needed to check. And in reality, it only had 20. So the software looks for sensor 21 in all of the memory that exists in the machine. And unfortunately, it also starts to look at the memory that doesn't exist in the machine. So, like getting a 300-page book and asking for page 301, right? CrowdStrike software, it was asking for page 301, and then as it was going around, it was crashing the systems that it was looking through, including Windows, because it's embedded inside of it. Now, if CrowdStrike had used Rust instead of C or C++, the kind of error would have been impossible, right? If you tried to put that code if you tried to compile that code, it would have failed in Rust, right? Because if it would point out your error, it would suggest that, you're looking for more sensors than you actually have available. So if CrowdStrike had used Rust, it wouldn't have had the same level of disaster that it did have. So, Rust is admitted as slower to develop in, rather. So it's best to use Rust for your critical applications, and anything else you want to use something like Go or Next.js for your backend needs, right? Now this stack is incredibly fast. It's incredibly responsive. It's very secure, and it's very efficient, right? So this type of language is something that you probably want to look at, or something that we're certainly looking at and in Cyclum a lot. And we're starting to look at how we can uh, leverage Rust and Go and these types of languages in our data engineering and AI engineering work. There's a problem with these types of languages. In fact, a problem with most of the types of languages that software is written in these days, and that those languages are sequential, right? So you can see in the video here, this is some basic Python that's creating a list and checking it twice. And it's going through line by line and executing this code as it goes through in one task at a time, right? And if you look at how that is applied within the to your cores, right, and to your processors, this is what it looks like. So all of the tasks that are being called by your code are being pushed through and processed by the processors one at a time. But why can't our code run like this, right? We know that on the machines that we use, that there's loads of CPUs, right? Tons in all the cores. So why is it that we're restricting ourselves to only using one at a time? And I mean, what we're looking at here is effectively parallel processing as part of the code that we develop, right? Everything's running the same time across all the cores in the CPU. Now, the problem is that writing this code is incredibly difficult, and most people don't bother trying using the types of languages that we're used to using, like Python, Rust, Go, etc. But this is starting to change. So we've got a couple of languages that we're starting to play with at Cyclum, right? They've been released in the last 12 months, and they effectively change this paradigm. So Bend and Mojo, or Moho, both allow you to write in Python, and then they do all of the work in parallelizing your code. So as an engineer, when you're writing your code as usual, there's no new techniques, no difficult concepts to master. The format is exactly like it is in Python, but the language in the back end manages the parallel processing component. So I showed you some Python code earlier, and if I chose to it normally runs across one CPU, and it gets this kind of performance, right? So if I put that same exact code into Bend and run it in parallel, I get 12 times the performance using the entire of my CPU, right? If I was to run it on a GPU, I get a massive 51 times boost, right? A factor, it increases the performance by factor 51. Now, this is just consumer hardware, right? So CPU on a MacBook or the GPU on a MacBook is graphics software. So this is a huge thing. This is a huge boost just on my machine. But let's look at a possibly a more difficult algorithm, right? So the Mandelbrot algorithm, it's a complex algorithm for processing fractals. Please don't ask me any questions about it in the chat. I don't know that much about it, right? But if you think of it as the equivalent of a kind of a massive big data transformation, right? So if I take the Python version and I run that in the cloud, it'll take thousands of seconds. Now, if I copy that same code into Mojo, oops, that's the wrong button. Those thousands of seconds, right, to process the Mandelbrot algorithm go down to 0.03 of a second, which is 68,000 times faster, right? So 68,000 times faster is an insane performance boost. So just to give you a flavor of the capability of these types of languages, right? This is a scaled improvement in performance. So these are the sorts of things that we're looking at internally at the moment, in how we the types of technologies that we're looking at. So to move on to AI, um, one of the big trends that we see in AI is the move away from what we would call assistant AI, or if you think about the parent helper that we were using earlier, it's an assistant AI. So it responds to prompts, it responds to human interaction. If we look at agentic AI, what we want to do is we want to give those bots agency. So we want to give them the ability to complete an action or an intervention that produces a particular effect. But more to the point, what we want those things to do is we want them to do them autonomously. So if we look at how we move from the assistant AI to agent AI, we don't want these things to respond to prompts. We want them to be able to act on their own agency, or to be able to do things independently with, without being directed or supervised by humans. And some of the behaviors that we're expecting to see, things like how they're going to interact with other agents. They should be able to make decisions autonomously within a set of parameters. We expect them to be able to complete complex tasks without constant oversight, and we want them to be goal oriented. So we will give these things objectives, and they, within that framework of the decision making, they should be able to make up their own minds about what they want to do and then to actually do it. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like from an architectural perspective or a logical architectural perspective, and again, some of the types of behaviors that we'd expect. So when we give the agent a request, or we give it a task or something that we expect it to do, it'll go through these, some version of these three stages, right? So there'll be a perception stage where it takes in the input either from cameras, texts, audios, or if it's hooked up to sensors, and it'll interpret it'll interpret the data that it's receiving, right? And then it'll use things like natural language processing as an example of a technology that would be used in that instance, right? What we then want it to do is we want it to take that input, and we know that it knows what its goals are, right? It's got memory, so it knows what's happened in the past, or it has some view of what's happened in the past. It's been trained to do a certain thing. There's some information within the knowledge base that it might have access to, and we expect it to use interpretation and reasoning to come to a decision, right? And then finally, we expect it to work out what a workflow would look like. So that it'll generate a workflow off the back of the decision that it's made in how it's going to act off the back of that decision. And then finally, we want it to execute those tasks. So again, because it's goal oriented and because it's continuously learning and adapting, it's going to be able to refine the decision making process and also refine the action or the executing task process. And all of this should happen autonomously in the background, right? And that is what we mean by agentic AI. So it's the natural evolution of the types of AI assistants that we've been building up to this point. So that's 2025. I'm massively over on time, so we'll try to go through this stuff relatively quickly, and you guys can ask lots of questions on the personal development side of things. But I want to give you guys a sense of the types of skills that we're looking for, and some of the things that we need from the perspective of how we meet our clients' needs going forward, right? So we talked a lot about a responsible AI, right? This is something that we're going to be doing a lot with our clients, and what we're looking for is people with data and AI strategy or governance skills and capability. So people who can come into client site, talk to them about their objectives and their business, and help them to design policies and processes that will help them to manage the governance of their AI applications, to create centers of excellence, to set up education programs. Over reliance on AI is a very interesting concept. That's a very key pillar of the risks around AI. So what we're talking about there is how do we stop our people from losing their creativity and their critical thinking and become over reliant on these AI systems. And that's something that a lot of our clients talk to us about as a real concern that's out in the industry. We then have things like people who are specialists in compliance, people who know about the AI Act in Europe, for example, or people who can look at how to apply the ISO 42001 standard. And then again, operational stuff that needs to be in place, DevOps, MLOps. How do we introduce observability into our clients' data estates or AI systems, estates? How do we increase the quality and the frequency and the accuracy of the monitoring of these systems and how they work? Data, we talked about that. That's huge. We do a lot of work in data governance, data quality, master data management, discoverability. So a lot of things around how people manage their data estates. And then again, design and development standards. So as you start to get more into the standards and the strategic ways of thinking around these things, you start to design how standards around transparency. How do we make models transparent and explainability frameworks, decision logging? So how do we set standards up around the development and the deployment of these models so that our clients can use them safely and effectively? From a technical perspective, one thing that I wanted to flag, which I think is interesting, I read this in a few places and I've seen this, we've started to see this coming when you really think about it. It's something that we've seen over the last few years anyway. Um, we're starting to move away from the best of breed platforms. So what we're starting to see is people moving more to DevOps platforms or stack platforms, as they would have been called back in the old day. Um, the GIF you can see is an example there of what an Azure stack platform would look like. But we want to see things like the use of automation in CI/CD processing, application portfolio management, performance management, again, monitoring and alerts. These are sort of operational side of how we deploy into environments. But we're starting to, and one of the things that the observations that the article make, which I think is very clear, is these best of breed companies have started to merge and acquire each other over the last few years, and that's something, if you've been paying attention, that you'll have noticed. But again, the stat at the bottom there, 50% of enterprises are going to abandon their best of breed platforms and move to DevOps platforms. So as developers, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're adapting to that. So you need to start to think about how many skills do you have in working within these frameworks? How much do you know about CI/CD in the Amazon environment, in the Microsoft environment, in the GCP environment, right? These are all things that you need to be aware of. So all very important skills for us to be looking at from a development perspective. So from a Gen AI perspective, one of the things that we do internally is we have a Gen AI upskill program, right? And this is for all the developers that we have across the organization. You can see some of the things about it on the left-hand side there. So there's multiple learning paths, right? If you want to come in as a developer, if you want to focus more on the data side, the DevOps side, if you want to work on QA automation, we all have training tracks that sit in each of these areas. You can see some of the topics that we cover. There's the fundamentals, in terms of the foundational side of what we need to do for these technologies. We look at neural networks, large language models, RAG, graph TVs, use cases, services, all these sorts of things. When we initially did this, it was, I think, a 6 or 7 month program, and it was incredibly hard. So I think we had a lot of people go through, and it was very onerous. There was, I think, 30 to 40 days worth of content and stuff that people had to do. So we've pared that down now, and it goes in chunks. So there's still the same level of content, but you can do it in phases. And the first phase is something like a 1 to 2 month. It takes about 1 to 2 months to get through it all. There's about 18 days worth of effort involved. And you can see that we have different ways of consuming the training for all the students in the program. Some of it's online training, so we'll go out and get them out to do courses, but we also put them in touch with senior engineers who mentor them through these processes. So you'll get to work with the students that go into these programs will get to work with experienced data scientists who worked on some of the projects that we've talked about, like in terms of the stuff that we've done with Inspired, or if you've been around for some of the other speakers corners, you might have seen some of the other projects we worked on for Insight or some of those other engagements. So the people who work on those projects will be mentoring the people in this program. And then finally, the list on the right-hand side there, everybody gets an assignment at the end of the program. So everybody has to pick an application that they're going to develop, and they have to basically build that. And these are some of the examples that we give to the students on that, or give to the students on that course, of the types of applications that they can work on. So staying current, um, it's kind of difficult to give some kind of industry standard advice. So what I thought is I'd talk a little bit about the types of things that I do, or the types of things that I've done over the years in order to make sure that I'm staying on top of what's going on. It is a very important part of my job, because I need to kind of think strategically about what we're going to do as an organization and what we're going to take to market. So I thought it'd be useful for you guys to get a sense of the types of things that I get involved with outside of my daily working life, in order to make sure that I'm staying on top of the industry, that I'm staying current with what's going on, but also that I'm keeping my hands keeping my hands dirty in terms of the getting the work done, and understanding how this technology works on the ground, right? So the first thing that I do is I pay attention, right? So I keep track on what's going on in the industry, and there's lots of ways that I do that, right? There's obviously social media. I do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn looking at articles and sort of seeing what's coming out. You do have to be a little bit you have to be a little bit careful on how you filter a lot of the stuff that comes through there. But then I also subscribe to the MIT Technology Review, which I find very useful. There's a lot of great articles in there. There's a lot of really good content. And then, other industry standards, other industry monitoring people. I don't know what you call them, caught by Gartner. People who pay attention to what's going on, and they can tell you a lot. Forrester is another example. Um, and then, I think the other thing that's important to mention is that the media is starting to catch up, right? You can see a screenshot there of the Lex Friedman podcast, which I actually listen to pretty regularly. But they had an episode with the CEO of Anthropic, who came on to discuss AI for 2 or 3 hours. It was brilliant. I recommend everybody to go and listen to that if you haven't listened to it already. But you know, there's lots of long form podcasts out there. There's tons of media stuff, that you can read through. I know Reddit's probably a great place for content. I know a lot of the guys that I work with, from a development perspective, that they get a lot of their content that way. But find the right mixed view, but definitely pay attention to what's going on in the industry. That's really important. I think keeping up on your training is massively important as well. So, I keep track. I have a Udemy account, personal Udemy account. I do courses from time to time just to make sure that I'm staying on top of things. University is actually really good at this. And one day when I get some time, I'm definitely going to go and do some of these courses. But there are free courses that you could do online. I think MIT has some free courses that you can do. I think Stanford's got some. And there's some of them use like real industry leaders like Andrew Ng, who's been I think I did his AI course on Udemy a little while, like a few years back. But pay attention to, there's lots of places where you can go and get access to training that's really useful. So, and some of it's on, you can train on any of the things just about that we've talked about. Although I haven't see if there's any Udemy courses on Rust yet, but I suppose there probably is. Maybe not on Bend or Moho, but maybe, you never know. It's worth looking. I think experimenting is the other thing that you need to do. And this is something that I try to do as often as I can, right? So I try to do as much coding as I can. So go out and use some of the tools that we talked about, right? I included Cursor in there because that's something that was mentioned on that Lex Friedman podcast, where they actually have an AI assistant baked into it. It's an IDE, that coding IDE that has an AI assistant baked into it. So go out and find these things and mess around with them, right? Just there's no excuse there. No, there's no replacement for me for practical experience, right? Actually sitting down and writing code and seeing the things work. I don't think there's a replacement for that. You can do all the courses you like, but until you start to get your hands dirty and start to get into working with this stuff, I don't think you're not gonna be as effective as in keeping current as you are with experimenting or playing with these technologies. And then finally, just pay attention to what's going on in the industry from a vendor perspective, right? Keep tabs on. I know I pay attention to what all these guys are doing. I pay attention to OpenAI. We're in the process of trying to set up a partnership with them, so that's something I'm trying to get closer to what they're doing as a vendor. But there's some really exciting vendors out there, right? Like Anthropic is doing some really cool stuff. Google, obviously, Microsoft. These are all companies that are doing some really exciting things, and actually, these are all technologies that we tend to work with at Cyclone, right? We've used ChatGPT we've got instances of ChatGPT into production for clients that we've, developed integration platforms around. So keeping a track of what's going on with the vendors is a really useful way of staying current. And it's definitely worth investing your time for any of these activities. So, um, as you can see, my work on getting these slide animations is a little bit lacking on this particular slide, but we'll go through the rest of it anyway. Just to summarize some of the stuff that we've talked about, 2025 trends. AI is going to be embedded in everything, right? You're starting to see that. Getting used to AI, not just developing it, but using it effectively is going to be a massive thing that you're going to want to spend your time investing in 2025, because we're going to see that embedded in everything. And as software developers, this is going to be particularly acute for us. One of the things that came out in that podcast, that Lex Friedman podcast, was, you know, um, one of the points that he made was that AI is going to tend to have an impact on things that are close to it. And software development is about as close as you can get as a human based industry to AI. So expect massive impact on the software development process. And that be one of the first things that we see that's impacted. Um, Ethics and regulation. I won't belabor the point, but we've seen the regulation come in this year, and this is something that's very important. Governance is something that you need to be aware of when you're developing these solutions, right? You need to think about it in the same way that you think about GDPR, right? That's how I approach it. You always ask the questions when you're developing this stuff. Is the model transparent? Do we have explainability? Do we have monitoring in place to make sure that if we are building stuff that's going to hallucinate, we can pick up those hallucinations? Can we respond to those issues as quickly as possible, right? Do I have all of those things in place so that I can be smart and safe and responsible while I'm developing this technology? AI assisted development, I'd encourage everybody to go out and mess around with some of the stuff that we talked about. Think about how you can use these assistants effectively, because they will make you more productive and more efficient. And um, you're probably not going to have much of a choice. Eventually, when you sit down, your ID that's going to be given to you by your employers is going to have an AI assistant in there, and all of the coding standards and everything is going to be baked into it. So just get used to the idea of using those. And look out for agentic AI. Start to think about how you can, when you're starting to look at how you design and build these processes, or these applications or systems, how can you build autonomy into them, right? So, last thing, takeaways, right? Take the time to modernize your skills, right? Do the training, pay attention to the industry. It's moving very quickly, and you don't want to get left behind. Continuous learning. I mean, we're all in software. We've been doing this our whole careers, or at least most of us have. You always have to stay on top of what's going on around you. Adapting to new ways of working is something that we probably do a lot when you think about, the evolvement of DevOps over the years. For those of us who can remember what life was like before we had CI/CD pipelines, and we had to release everything by copying and pasting or emailing code or saving it in folders so that the deployment teams could pick it up. But working with AI is going to be another paradigm change, similar, probably more impactful than that was on us. So it's something to pay attention to. Um, Again, working at the forefront of adoption. So try to find somewhere that's doing cutting edge stuff, right? Try to find an organization that's going to push the boat out, that's going to invest in adoption. That's something that we, as an organization, have to do in order to stay competitive, but also it's something that we look for when we're working with clients, right? So working with clients that aren't afraid of new technology and are excited about the promise that it can bring is something that's very useful. Um, Training and practical experience, and working with leading technology providers. So, like I said, getting that practical experience is massively important. Getting the support that you need to be able to do that, getting access to those tools is something that, I would encourage you to do. So think about how you can get that access when you're developing your career and who you want to try and involve or who you want to try and build your career with. Collaborate and learn from working with the best and most experienced people in the field, and then take your place among them. I think, this is something that I've been very lucky with in my career. I've worked with some incredibly smart, talented, driven professionals, and I wouldn't be where I am today without those people, right? So, um, collaboration when you get into these communities, or when you work with these organizations, is incredibly important. And finally, these are all things that you can do if you come and work with us at Sickle. So, more than welcome to have a go and try and join us. I think it's something that I think, as like I said, I joined this organization over the last year, and I was very impressed when I was looking into them at the capability that they have, and I'm continuously impressed now that I've joined and I've seen what it looks like behind the curtain, and seeing, the types of people that we have, the seniority of the developers that we have, the creativity that they have in the work that we do. So, I can't. I know I'm biased, right? Fair enough, but I think it's a great place to work, and I think you should definitely consider us. And that's it.
Thank you, Dan. Colleagues, now it's the right time for us to go ahead and ask you questions related to everything that you heard. We have one of the questions that was already there in the chat, so I would ask you then to cover it. So, which industries are currently underutilizing AI, and what are the opportunities for growth in those sectors?
Good question. All of them. Yeah, I think I, we we work across a lot. We do work a lot across a lot of these industries, right? And um, I mean, if I had to pick some examples of the types of industries that we struggle with, I think if we go back to the reputational thing, like a lot of people worried about risk. I think certainly elements of financial services and insurance. I think the technologies, AI technology is certainly underutilized there. They do use obviously data and analytics very effectively. Um, but I think from an AI perspective, they tend to be quite risk averse. So we're seeing, that's one example. Um, Trying to think of other examples where manufacturing is maybe another example of an organization where, I think probably why I say that is because I can just see so many amazing use cases for AI technology in manufacturing. And again, they use things like RPA very effectively in a lot of places in manufacturing, obviously. But I think there's just a lot more that they could do. Um, Conversely, I think where we start to see more of it is organizations like retail. We do a lot of work with retail organizations that are very interested in how this technology can work, and they're starting to explore it. I think anyone who's got large customer bases and they spend a lot on customer service, we start to see them coming in and looking at how they can leverage this technology effectively. Um, but I think, yeah, probably financial services, insurance, government, right? Public sector. Again, they're looking into it, but they seem to be very slow to adopt. But then that's not weird. The government's always slow to adopt new technology. They're very risk averse, aren't they? So I don't know. That's probably where I would say is probably the main areas, the main industries.